I've always been a hunter of strange places, but the 3 o'clock in the morning cafe was different. There were no photos on Google, no mention on Instagram, not even on Reddit, just rumors. It's only for those who know, they'd say, always with a warning tone, as if the cafe held a secret too heavy to reveal. It was the kind of mystery I couldn't resist. Finding the location wasn't easy, but after a few nights scouring obscure forums and listening to fragmented stories, I found the address, a forgotten street in the city center, surrounded by abandoned buildings. It was exactly what I needed to make a sleepless night interesting. After all, what harm could there be in having coffee at 3 o'clock in the morning? I arrived a few minutes before 3 o'clock in the morning, and the place was even stranger than I expected. There was no flashy facade or illuminated sign, just an old wooden door with peeling paint. A chalkboard leaned against the wall, with rules written so unevenly that it looked like it was done by someone in a hurry or with trembling hands. Only enter if invited. Never order the same thing twice. And so on. It seemed like a prank to scare curious people. But what really intrigued me was the silence. No sound of conversations or coffee machines. Only the cold wind of the early morning. I sighed, pushed the door open, and stepped inside, ignoring the first rule without a second thought. As soon as I passed the threshold, I felt something different. I can't quite explain it, but the air seemed denser inside, as if I was entering another world. The cafe was small, with tables and chairs that seemed to come from different decades, but nothing really matched. A cracked wooden table, a plastic chair, an iron bench, as if everything had been thrown there without any care. The lights flickered strangely, casting shadows that seemed to move slower than the light. I had to swallow my discomfort as I tried not to stare directly at the other patrons. But it wasn't easy because they didn't seem exactly normal. They were all motionless. A couple of men, a woman with short hair, and someone sitting in the corner with a hat hiding half their face. They weren't talking or checking their phones or reading. They were just there looking at the tables or the floor like mannequins left in fixed positions. A wave of regret washed over me, but I was already inside. A waitress appeared out of nowhere, almost making me jump. "What will you order?" she asked. Her voice was normal, but her smile seemed forced. It was hard to explain, but her expression didn't match the tone. I chose the first coffee on the menu to quickly get it over with. She wrote it down, turned her back, and disappeared through a door I hadn't noticed before. While I waited for my order, I looked around trying to distract myself. But the more I observed the place, the more wrong everything seemed. The wallpaper was old and peeling, revealing layers of different colors underneath, as if they had painted it many times without ever bothering to remove the previous layers. On the counter, a clock showed 3:13 o'clock in the morning, but the ticking was irregular, almost anxious, as if time itself was hesitant to move forward. The feeling of being watched intensified, but I knew no one was looking directly at me. Everyone remained in those static, uncomfortable poses. That's when I noticed something bizarre. Their shadows seemed to move on their own, as if they were restless. A shiver ran down my spine, but I tried to ignore it. When the waitress returned with my coffee, she placed the cup in front of me without saying a word and left before I could thank her. The smell was strong, almost nauseating, but I needed to taste it. I took a sip, and the taste was strange. Not bad, but as if there was something more there, something metallic or bitter that I couldn't identify. I put the cup on the table and stared at it, trying to understand what exactly was bothering me. That's when I realized the coffee was reflecting something like a mirror, but the image didn't make sense. I saw my face, but the background wasn't the coffee. It was a dark place with tall, distorted figures standing amidst a fog. I blinked, and the image disappeared, but the coffee remained there, staring back at me. I wanted to leave, but something held me back. It wasn't just fear. It was as if the coffee itself didn't want me to leave. I took a deep breath, trying to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks, but the feeling of unease only grew. I decided I needed to distract myself, so I did something that clearly broke one of the rules. I looked directly at the other patrons. I started with the man nearest to me, sitting to my right. He was tall and wore an old suit, but what caught my attention was his face. It seemed out of focus. I don't know how to describe it. It wasn't that I couldn't see the details. It was as if my brain couldn't process what was in front of me. My stomach churned, and I quickly turned my face away. Then I made the mistake of looking at the woman with short hair. Unlike the man, her face was perfectly clear, but there was something wrong with her eyes. They were too large, disproportionate, and she wasn't blinking. When our eyes met, time seemed to stop. My body froze, and everything around fell silent. The flickering lights stopped blinking, and I could hear my heart pounding loudly in my chest. I don't know how long I was trapped in that moment, but when she smiled, a wide, impossible smile that stretched almost from ear to ear, I knew I had made a mistake. A soft laugh echoed through the cafe, but it didn't come from anyone. It was as if the entire place was laughing at me. I stood up quickly, knocking over my chair in the process, but no one reacted. Not the waitress, not the other patrons. Only that enormous smile remained on the woman's face, as if it were etched into her features. I tried to avoid looking again, but it was as if something was pulling me back. In the corner of my eye, I saw the man with the hat move for the first time. He didn't turn his head, but his hat slipped slightly, revealing part of his face. I shouldn't have looked. Underneath the hat, where a face should have been, there was only dense darkness, as if the very idea of a face had been erased. My legs began to weaken, and the coffee became unbearably hot. Then I heard the bell ring. At first, I thought it was in my head, but the sound grew louder, more insistent, filling every corner of the place. I remembered the rule. If you hear the bell ring, close your eyes and don't move until it stops. But it was too late. My instincts failed me, and I turned to look at the door where the sound was coming from. But the door wasn't there. In its place was something I can't describe, an irregular opening, surrounded by shadows that seemed alive, pulsing. The shadows began to creep across the floor towards me, and that's when I realized that none of the other patrons were moving. They knew. I didn't, and I had broken the rule. The shadows continued to advance slowly, but there was something wrong with the way they moved. They didn't obey logic, spreading irregularly, twisting, and creating shapes that looked human, but weren't. My instincts screamed to run, but my feet felt glued to the floor. All sound in the cafe had disappeared, except for the bell, which continued to ring, louder with each passing second. The other patrons remained motionless, as if trapped in a trance. The woman with short hair still smiled, but now she seemed to observe me with malicious curiosity, as if she knew exactly what was about to happen. At that moment, the waitress reappeared. She emerged from the previously unseen door, holding what looked like a notepad, but her eyes were different. There was no trace of humanity left in them. They were completely black, shining in the flickering cafe light. She approached slowly, her footsteps echoing on the wooden floor, and extended her hand with an almost mechanical movement, pointing to the clock on the counter. It read 3:47 o'clock in the morning. A sense of panic overwhelmed me as I realized what that meant. If I didn't leave there within 13 minutes, it would be too late. But how could I escape when everything around seemed like a living trap? Gathering all the strength I still had, I forced myself to move. Each step felt like a colossal effort, as if the air around me were made of concrete. I tried to run towards the door, but it remained vanished, replaced by that dark opening, which now seemed to breathe. The shadows emanating from it rose higher, taking on shapes that looked human, but were wrong. The arms were too long, the heads tilted at impossible angles. No matter where I looked, there was something horrifying waiting. I looked at the clock again. 3:51 o'clock in the morning. Time was running out, but I was trapped in something that seemed to test me, torment me. I remember the chalkboard and the rules. Leave before 4 o'clock in the morning. But how? I had to risk it, so I did something that at that moment seemed insane. I walked towards the counter, towards the waitress. Her black eyes followed me, but she didn't move. I pointed at the vanished door and stammered something like, "How do I get out of here?" She tilted her head, assessing me, and then, to my surprise, laughed. It wasn't a human laugh. It was distorted, metallic, as if someone was mimicking the sound. Then, she pointed again at the clock, which now read 3:55 o'clock in the morning. Leaving me no other choice, she pointed to the dark opening, as if that was the only way out. My stomach churned. It couldn't be. I knew that entering that dark opening was a terrible idea, but it seemed like all other options had vanished. The shadows around it were more agitated, almost hungry, and the few moments of hesitation I had only worsened the situation. When I looked at the clock again, it read 3:58 o'clock in the morning. I had no time. I took a deep breath and forced myself to walk towards that pulsating void, but each step felt like tearing a piece of myself away. The feeling of being watched became unbearable, as if dozens of unseen eyes pierced me. The bell continued to ring, louder and more frantic, and I just wanted it to end. When I finally reached the opening, I hesitated. The air there was cold, dense, and had a smell I'll never forget. Something like iron mixed with wet, rotten earth. I took one last look back, hoping, begging for another way out. The other patrons were now standing, but not as people. Their bodies were elongated, deformed, as if they had been sculpted from wax and melted afterward. The woman with short hair smile was still there, but now it extended to where her ears should have been, and her eyes shone, like headlights pointed directly at me. The clock struck the first chime of 3:59 o'clock in the morning. I didn't think anymore. I threw myself into the darkness. As soon as I crossed the threshold, I was swallowed by the void. There was no sound, light, or any sense of direction. It was like falling, but without gravity, an endless fall into nothingness. My body seemed to be crushed and stretched at the same time, as if I were part of a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I don't know how long I was trapped in that darkness, but then, suddenly, everything stopped. My feet touched something solid, and a chilling cold swept over my body. I opened my eyes and realized I was back in the cafe, or at least a distorted version of it. The tables and chairs were piled in a corner, forming a grotesque pile that seemed alive, pulsating like a giant heart. The waitress was there too, but now her face had no features, just a smooth, pale surface like wax. She held the notepad, writing something with quick, frantic movements, but when I tried to approach, a sound of footsteps echoed behind me. I turned around immediately and saw the shadows. They were there, taller, more defined, like figures of pure darkness, and they were all looking directly at me. The bell rang again, a long, deep sound, and the clock struck 4 o'clock in the morning. The instant the clock struck 4 o'clock in the morning, everything changed. The shadowy figures advanced, but not by walking. They stretched, traversing space in impossible leaps, as if time itself was being distorted. Instinctively, I closed my eyes and huddled, expecting the worst. But instead of feeling any impact or being pulled by those shadows, everything suddenly fell silent. The bell stopped ringing, and absolute silence descended. I didn't know if I was alive or dead. When I finally opened my eyes, I realized I was back on the street in front of the cafe. The wooden door was closed, as if nothing had happened. The chalkboard was still there, with the same unevenly written rules. I looked around, searching for any sign of the shadows or grotesque figures, but everything was empty. The clock on my phone read 1 o'clock in the morning. For a moment, I thought about knocking on the door, demanding answers, but something inside me stopped me. I knew going back would be a sentence, and yet, part of me felt the cafe hadn't finished with me. As I walked away, one last glance at the place revealed something that made me freeze. The message on the board had changed. Return when invited. It now read, with an even more trembling hand. I never walked down that street again, but to this day, I wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning with the sound of that bell echoing in my mind.